It is a Saturday evening in the middle of August, and 12,000 people in Indianapolis, Indiana, are packed in front of an outdoor stage at the Indiana State Fair, waiting for Sugarland to perform. The fair is one of the oldest and most attended in the country, a tradition embedded in entire families, and that evening it feels exactly like what it always has: ordinary, joyful, familiar. Singer Sarah Bareilles has already completed her opening set. The crew is preparing the stage, and the crowd in the standing fan zone directly in front of the structure, a section the fan base calls the Sugar Pit, is doing what crowds do before a sold-out show. Very few of them have any idea that the structure above their heads has been described in writing for years as unsafe to operate in strong wind. By 8:47, that structure will be on top of them, and every single warning will have already been given. To understand what happened at the Indiana State Fair, you have to understand what an outdoor concert stage actually is, because the part the audience sees, the platform, the backdrop, the lights, is only the surface of something much larger and more complex standing above it. At any major outdoor production, the performance area is covered and framed by a temporary structural system that holds the entire show together. Lighting rigs, speaker arrays, rigging points, and technical equipment are all suspended from a towering framework of aluminum tubing and connectors called a truss system. This framework rises far above the stage itself, high enough to house spot operators in elevated positions and to distribute sound and light across a large outdoor audience. It is essentially a temporary building, assembled before each show, loaded with thousands of pounds of equipment, and then disassembled and moved to the next city. The company responsible for building and leasing the structure at the Indiana State Fair was a Greenfield, Indiana-based firm called Mid-America Sound Corporation, and they erected this same roof system at the fairgrounds every season. What they had put up for the Sugarland concert was 62 feet tall and, once all the production equipment was mounted and suspended, weighed 35 tons in total. The critical question for any structure this size is not how it bears weight from above, but how it holds its position against force from the side. Wind does not push down, it pushes sideways, and a freestanding aluminum frame of this height will tip over if it is not anchored laterally. The anchoring system at this stage consisted of a network of cables called guy lines, running from the upper sections of the truss framework down to anchor points on the ground. At those anchor points, instead of driven stakes or concrete footings embedded in the earth, the cables were connected to concrete jersey barriers, the same type of heavy rectangular dividers used to separate highway lanes, and the assumption was that their combined mass would provide sufficient resistance. Each barrier weighed several thousand pounds and sat directly on the surface of the ground, with nothing holding it down other than friction between concrete and earth. When engineers from Thornton Tomasetti later analyzed this system in forensic detail, cataloging thousands of individual components, conducting wind tunnel analysis, running laser measurements across the collapsed structure, what they found was that this anchoring method could only resist lateral wind forces of between 25 and 43 miles per hour, depending on the direction the wind came from. To put that in perspective, the American Society of Civil Engineers publishes the engineering standards that govern what structures of this type and occupancy are required to withstand. Those standards, which existed and were known to the industry long before this concert took place, specified a minimum wind resistance threshold of 68 miles per hour. The stage at the Indiana State Fair was rated to less than half of what the applicable standard required. On a bad afternoon in the Midwest, this structure was already at its limit. What makes this harder to absorb is that none of this was a secret. Mid-America Sound had provided the Indiana State Fair Commission with written documentation alongside this structure every single year for close to a decade, and that documentation contained a warning. The roof shall not be used in high winds or severe inclement weather, defining high winds as anything above 25 miles per hour. The Fair Commission received this paper every year, and every year nothing was done with it. No protocol written, no wind speed threshold incorporated into any emergency plan, no individual designated with the authority to look at a weather forecast and make the call that a show could not proceed. The warning existed in writing. The institutional response to it did not. There is one more layer to this that the Thornton Tomasetti investigation uncovered, and it makes the structural picture even more troubling. The truss system had originally been designed by a Tennessee-based firm called James Thomas Engineering. Their design specifications were already inadequate for the loads the structure would carry, but beyond the inadequacy of the original design, when Mid-America Sound assembled the structure on-site for the Sugarland concert, the physical installation deviated from the engineering specifications that did exist. The anchor system was not set up as the plans described, and when Sugarland's production company attached their own rigging and lighting equipment to the truss, no independent engineering review was conducted to confirm whether that additional load was safe. The structure that stood above the crowd that evening had been inadequately designed, incorrectly assembled, and never reviewed after the fact, inside a regulatory framework that did not require any of those reviews to take place. Indiana's building code at the time formally exempted temporary outdoor structures from the requirements applied to permanent venues, which meant no government agency had a legal mandate to inspect it. The city of Indianapolis had its own inspection authority for temporary structures, but had no jurisdiction on state property. The state fire marshal did not cover outdoor staging, and in every direction you looked for a body with both the authority and the obligation to verify this structure was safe. There was a gap where one should have been. The storm that swept through Indianapolis that evening had been forecast with considerable accuracy for the better part of the day, tracked by meteorologists who had been watching a system develop across central Indiana since the morning hours. By early afternoon, it was clear that severe conditions were building across the region. This was not a freak gust that appeared out of a cloudless sky, but a documented, communicated, developing storm that everyone with access to a forecast knew about, and the fair's own staff had been in direct contact with the National Weather Service about it since mid-afternoon. The first formal contact between fair officials and the National Weather Service happened just after 5:30 that evening, and the picture they received was straightforward. A significant storm system was moving toward Indianapolis, and the surrounding area was in the zone of concern. Within 30 minutes of that call, the Storm Prediction Center had elevated its assessment and issued a severe thunderstorm watch that included the exact coordinates of the fairgrounds, with an automated text message system immediately notifying Fair Commission staff while 2 hours still remained before the concert was scheduled to begin. By 7 o'clock, the forecast had sharpened considerably, with meteorologists communicating directly to fair officials that a thunderstorm carrying heavy rain, lightning, large hail, and strong winds was on track to reach the fairgrounds between 9 and 9:30 that evening. The automated system again sent alerts to staff, but what nobody outside the Fair Commission was informed of, not the contractors, not the security firms, not the stage builder whose written safety documentation was sitting on a shelf somewhere, was any of this. The notification system had been built to reach fair staff only, and everyone else on that site was dependent on those staff members deciding to pass the information along. At 8 o'clock, Fair Executive Director Cindy Hoy convened a meeting to discuss what the evening's weather forecast meant for the concert. The storm was now projected to arrive at around 9:15, which would be roughly 30 minutes after the concert was due to start at 8:45. Hoy's instinct was to push the show back, to wait out the storm and then allow the performance to proceed in safer conditions. The problem was that she did not have unilateral authority to make that call. In fact, no one in that meeting did, at least not in any formally defined sense. A representative was sent to speak with Sugarland's touring team. The conversation that followed is one of the most consequential small details of this entire story. When the band's tour manager, Helen Rollins, was informed about the approaching weather, she was told about rain. She was not told that the forecast included lightning or high winds, or hail with the diameter of golf balls. She was told it was going to rain, and her response was completely consistent with that information. Sugarland plays in rain all the time. Rather than delay the show, Rollins wanted to start as close to on time as possible and stop mid-performance only if conditions on the ground demanded it. The lead singer needed 30 minutes to properly warm her voice before performing. The band also had a long overnight drive to their next show. A second approach to the band's management produced the same answer. The final compromise was a 5-minute delay, pushing the start time to 8:50. When Hoy received this decision, she accepted it, partly because Sugarland's performance contract contained a clause giving the band final authority over weather-related cancellations, authority they had exercised even if unknowingly on incomplete information. Around 8:30, something happened backstage that shifted the atmosphere considerably. Indiana State Police Captain Brad Weaver was at the fairgrounds that evening, off-duty there, with his wife to see the concert. When he encountered Hoy near the stage area, he looked at what the sky was doing to the northwest and told her plainly that if this were his call, he would shut the entire event down. Weaver was not a meteorologist, but he was a trained public safety professional looking at dark, fast-moving clouds and applying straightforward logic to the situation. Hoy directed her staff to begin preparing for a possible evacuation of the grandstand. At 8:39, the National Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm warning for Marion County. Not a watch, which signals that conditions are favorable for severe weather, but a warning, meaning the storm was imminent and winds exceeding 60 miles per hour were already expected. That warning was registered in the meteorological record at exactly 8:39, and it never reached Hoy, and it never reached Weaver. The two people who were at that moment actively working out what to do with 12,000 people in an open-air venue had no knowledge that the formal escalation had just occurred. At 8:40, Hoy drafted a message for the stage announcer, and 5 minutes later, With the crowd packed in front of an empty stage, the announcer took the microphone. He told the audience that a storm was on its way, that the show would still be going ahead, and that if conditions got worse during the performance, people should calmly move toward the exits and make their way to the covered pavilions nearby, naming each pavilion and describing the routes. What he did not do was tell anyone to leave. The announcement was informational rather than directional, a description of options rather than an instruction to act on them. When Captain Weaver heard it, he immediately confronted Hoy, telling her he had assumed the announcement would be an evacuation order. According to the investigation report compiled in the months that followed, Hoy looked at him, nodded, and the two of them began walking backstage together toward the microphone to issue a mandatory evacuation order. At 8:46, the wind arrived. The gust that hit the structure came from the northwest at approximately 59 miles per hour, and based on Thornton Tomasetti's forensic analysis of the anchor system, a northwest wind of around 28 miles per hour was already sufficient to begin overloading the guy line connections to the Jersey barriers. When the barriers began to slide, the cables connecting them to the truss framework went slack on one side and transferred enormous unbalanced force to the rest of the system, and the aluminum framework, 62 feet tall and loaded with 35 tons of suspended equipment, tipped forward and came down in the direction of the crowd. What the people standing in the sugar pit experienced in those seconds has been described by survivors as happening almost without warning. A sudden change in air pressure, a violent snap of the canvas canopy at the top of the structure, a sound like something mechanical giving way, and then the structure itself, lights and rigging and metal tubing falling into them. Sugarland's two members were on their tour bus at that moment, still preparing to walk to the stage, and were uninjured, while the people directly beneath the point of collapse were not. 4 people were killed at the scene. Tammy Van Dam was 42 years old. Glenn Goodrich was 49, a security guard who had been working the concert that night. Alina Big Johnny was 23, a recent graduate of Manchester College in Fort Wayne, who had come to see a show she had been looking forward to for months. Christina Santiago was 29, an LGBT rights activist who was at the concert with her partner, Alicia Brennan, who survived. 3 more people died from their injuries in the days that followed. Nathan Bird, a 51-year-old stagehand who had been working in the rigging structure when it fell, Jennifer Haskell, who was 22, and Megan Toothman, who was 24. 58 others were injured, many of them seriously and some of them permanently. Among the people in the sugar pit that evening were a mother and her 10-year-old daughter who had driven over 100 miles from home and waited nearly 4 hours in line to secure their spot near the front. When the structure fell, they were separated. The girl was found unconscious by a nurse who happened to be in the crowd, not breathing on her own, and was rushed to Riley Hospital for Children, where doctors placed her in a medically induced coma for close to 3 weeks while surgeons opened her skull to relieve the pressure of a severely swollen brain. Her mother, who sustained serious leg injuries in the collapse, was conscious enough in the back of an ambulance to ask a stranger to pray with her for her daughter, not yet knowing whether her child was alive. Years later, the girl's mother would tell journalists that she had not gotten back the daughter she had before that evening, that while her child had survived, the injury had changed her in ways that rehabilitation could only partially address. In the immediate aftermath, something remarkable happened in the crowd around the wreckage. People who had been standing feet away from the impact zone began pulling at the fallen aluminum and rigging with their bare hands, working alongside the first responders who arrived within minutes. The structure was impossibly heavy, but they persisted, trying to free whoever was trapped beneath it. Emergency medical teams mobilized across the city rapidly enough that every critically injured patient had been transported to a hospital within 80 minutes of the collapse. Indiana Task Force 1 conducted a systematic search of the debris site through the night, and by shortly after 11 o'clock, they were confident that no one remained trapped. The Indiana State Fair canceled all remaining concerts scheduled for the rest of that season. In the weeks immediately following the collapse, the state of Indiana commissioned 2 parallel investigations. The first was a forensic engineering inquiry tasked with determining why the structure had failed structurally. The second was a crisis management review designed to examine every decision made by the people responsible for the safety of that event, from the hours before the concert to the moment the stage came down. Taken together, the 2 reports constitute one of the most detailed post-incident analyses ever produced for an American outdoor event disaster. The engineering investigation was assigned to Thornton Tomasetti, a firm whose prior work gives some indication of the seriousness with which this assignment was approached. This was the same organization that had been brought in to investigate the structural failure of the World Trade Center towers after September 11, 2001, and that had led the engineering inquiry into the collapse of the Interstate 35W bridge in Minneapolis in 2007, a disaster that killed 13 people. Their approach to the Indiana State Fair was methodical and exhaustive. Thousands of individual components from the collapsed truss system were cataloged, measured, and tested, Wind tunnel analysis was conducted. Laser scanning produced precise documentation of how every element of the structure had been configured before it fell. The conclusions they reached were unambiguous. The lateral load resisting system, the guy lines and Jersey barrier anchors, was fundamentally inadequate for the forces it was supposed to resist. When tested and modeled against the engineering standards that govern structures of this type and occupancy, the anchor system failed at wind speeds between 25 and 43 miles per hour, depending on wind direction. The applicable standard required a minimum capacity of 68 miles per hour. The gust that caused the collapse was approximately 59 miles per hour, meaning the structure failed at a wind speed it was required to withstand and did not. But the more significant finding was that even at far lower wind speeds, this structure should never have been cleared for use with a crowd beneath it. The investigation also confirmed something that pushed responsibility further back in the chain. When Mid-America Sound assembled the structure on site, the physical installation differed from the specifications provided by the structure's original designers, James Thomas Engineering. According to the investigation, the original specifications did not match the conditions the structure experienced during the event. The report described several contributing factors, including differences between the planned and completed installation, the absence of a review after assembly, and safety procedures that were limited in scope. The second investigation, led by Witt Associates under former Federal Emergency Management Agency Director James Lee Witt, focused on how decisions were made during the event, how information was shared between the parties involved, and what procedures were in place at the time. Their findings described communication and coordination issues alongside the structural concerns discussed in the first investigation. There was no defined chain of command for public safety at the Indiana State Fair. The Fair Commission, the production company, the concert promoter, Sugarland's management, and the state police all operated in the same space with overlapping responsibilities and no formal document establishing who had the final word in an emergency. This ambiguity was not unusual in the outdoor events industry at the time. It was, in fact, the norm. But its consequences at the Indiana State Fair were severe. When Cindy Hoy wanted to delay the show, she found herself in negotiation rather than command. When Captain Weaver wanted to cancel it, he had no formal authority to act unilaterally. When the severe thunderstorm warning was issued at 8:39, there was no protocol in place to ensure that information reached the people who needed it, and so it reached no one who mattered. The investigation also drew attention to the automated weather notification system the Fair had installed, which had been configured to send alerts only to Fair Commission staff. Every other party operating on the grounds, contractors, security companies, the stage builder, public safety agencies, was excluded from those notifications. In a situation where decisive action depended on shared situational awareness, the information was being siloed at the exact moment it needed to move freely. Following both investigations, the Indiana Department of Labor announced formal penalties against 3 parties. Mid-America Sound Corporation received the largest fine under 3 violations described as knowing, a legal designation indicating the agency had concluded the company was aware of the risks and failed to address them, while the Indiana State Fair Commission was penalized for failing to properly evaluate safety conditions at its own venues, and the local chapter of the Stagehands Union was fined for violations connected to workers on the structure. Each party subsequently redirected responsibility. Mid-America Sound toward the Fair Commission, the Commission toward the band, and the band's team toward the incomplete information they had been given. In the legal proceedings that followed, these arguments would be examined in considerably more detail. The lawsuits began within months. Families of the 7 people who died, along with dozens of injured survivors, retained counsel from nearly 20 law firms across 3 states. The defendants named in the proceedings included the state of Indiana, the Indiana State Fair Commission, Mid-America Sound Corporation, Live Nation as the concert promoter, James Thomas Engineering, the Stagehands Union, and Sugarland itself. The inclusion of Sugarland as a defendant turned on a specific provision in the band's performance contract, one that most people in the audience that evening would never have thought about. That contract gave the band final authority over weather-related cancellations. The clause is standard practice in the live music industry, where tour managers routinely manage risk decisions around weather and venue conditions. But in this instance, that clause meant that under the formal terms of the agreement, fair officials could not have unilaterally canceled the show even if they had wanted to. And because the band's management had been given an incomplete description of the weather, rain, but not wind, lightning, or hail, their exercise of that authority was made without the information that would have changed the decision. The legal question of whether Sugarland bore liability for what followed occupied years of litigation. In 2014, The largest consolidated lawsuit reached a settlement of just under $50 million, with Indiana's share at $11 million and the remaining $39 million distributed among the other defendants, including the production company and Sugarland. ESG Security, a firm that had lost one of its own employees in the collapse, contested the case rather than settling, and in 2015 received a summary judgment in its favor, becoming the only defendant formally dismissed by the courts. Behind those settlement figures were injuries that no financial agreement could describe adequately, people who would never work again, people who spent months relearning how to form words or hold a pen, a young girl whose skull had been opened in surgery and whose mother told journalists years later that the child she brought home from the hospital was not the same child she had brought to the concert. The settlements closed the legal chapter, but they did not close anything else. What changed inside Indiana moved relatively quickly. The Fair Commission created a new staff position dedicated entirely to emergency management, a function that had not previously existed as a formal role, and introduced mandatory evacuation training across all personnel. The weather notification system was reconfigured to reach all parties on the grounds rather than Fair Commission staff alone, and state law was updated to require structural inspections of outdoor stages, changes substantial enough that by the middle of the following decade, the Indiana Department of Homeland Security was conducting 5,000 venue inspections annually. These were not symbolic gestures, but substantive corrections to specific failures that the investigations had identified by name. At the national level, the response took longer but reached further. The Indiana collapse prompted the formation of a new industry organization called the Event Safety Alliance, created by professionals from across the live entertainment sector who understood that what had happened in Indianapolis was not an aberration but a symptom. The Alliance produced the first comprehensive safety guide for the American outdoor events industry, addressing weather monitoring, structural certification, emergency communication, and the question of who holds authority when conditions change. For the first time, the industry had a document that tried to answer those questions before a disaster required it. Formal building code reform took longer still, and it was not until the 2024 edition of the International Building Code that legally codified national standards for publicly occupied temporary structures, including outdoor concert stages, were adopted at the federal level. 13 years between the collapse and the code, a gap that is its own form of evidence about how regulatory systems respond to categories of risk that existing law has not yet been forced to confront. There is one more piece of context necessary to fully understand what happened in Indianapolis, and it concerns what was happening elsewhere that same summer. The Indiana State Fair collapse was not the first major weather-induced stage failure of 2011. It was the third, following two similar incidents at outdoor concert venues earlier that season, and 5 days after Indianapolis. A stage collapse at a festival in Belgium, killing 7 more people and injuring dozens. 4 major collapses at outdoor concert events across a single summer, each a variation on the same theme. A temporary structure built without adequate engineering review, operating without a clear emergency protocol, at an event where no single authority held responsibility for the decision to stop. The pattern was visible to anyone looking across the industry as a whole, and the enforcement mechanisms to address it did not yet exist. The 7 people who died at the Indiana State Fair are cited by name in the Thornton Tomasetti Engineering Report. Their names appear in the Witt Associates Management Review. They are referenced in Event Safety Alliance documentation and in the academic literature that has analyzed this case as a study in institutional failure. They are present in the structure of the argument, in the building code revisions that finally established mandatory standards for structures like the one that killed them. Tammy Van Dam, Glenn Goodrich, Alina Big Johnny, Christina Santiago, Nathan Bird, Jennifer Haskell, Megan Toothman, 7 people who came to a concert on a Saturday evening in August and encountered a structure that had been signaling its own inadequacy for years, in an industry that had not yet been required to listen. What the Indiana State Fair collapse ultimately reveals is how a catastrophe can be assembled over years, piece by piece, from decisions that each seem individually reasonable or at least manageable, a building code exemption written without anticipating this scale of risk, a warning document filed and never acted upon, a notification system configured too narrowly, a conversation in which a single wrong word, rain instead of storm, determined everything that followed, and an announcement that described where to go without telling anyone to go. The wind did not create this tragedy, it only completed it.